Hello, my name is Mike Bell and I'm part of the team that makes up Gender Parity UK. And this little film is called Throwing Pebbles in a Pond because it's kind of encapsulates the philosophy we have for engaged campaigning on men's issues. If you have a pond and you throw a stone into it, it may sink to the bottom and you may not notice any difference. But if you keep throwing stones in, after a while, you do fill up the pond. And that's our general approach in gender parity, that although when we contact the press or an MP or whatever, or submit something to a consultation, we may not see any effect, that over the long term, if enough people do enough stuff will happen. So in this film, we want to explain how we got started, some of the difficulties we hit and how we solved them, and then to introduce some of the people who've been involved in gender parity over the last year or so, who will tell us something about what they've done. And we hope that this will inspire you to get engaged as well. Thank you. The group Gender Parity UK wasn't originally called that, but was started by Philip Tanzer. And so Philip, can you tell us what your motivation was in starting the group and perhaps what your experience was in the early days?
So when I started to become interested in men's issues and men's rights, I really wanted to make a difference. But because I live so far away from any city, 2.5 hours from Inverness, which is a small place, I thought there are very limited things that I can do in real life. For example, looking or helping with homelessness or being part of a physical group. And during last year's COVID-19 lockdown, I thought the best thing I can do is start doing something online. And then I thought Zoom meetings seem to be a great option. And I started reaching out to some people that I became aware of on Twitter, people that seem to be keen, but not too preoccupied with other organizations. That's how and why I started reaching out.
Okay, and what was your experience in those early meetings, and how do you think that the group's evolved since then?
I think in the beginning, there was a process of finding who we want to be and what we want to achieve. So in the beginning, it was very clearly a think tank of people with different backgrounds and different ideas. And we were talking about what we could do, how we could tackle certain things. But we didn't have a clear structure. We didn't have a name yet for the organization. So in the early days, we had to figure that out and figure out how we could best work together and how different personalities and different talents could best work together. And some people work very well together and other people work better alone or just one-on-one. And these were things that we had to figure out in the beginning.
Yes, I think in some of our early conversations, we realized that trying to work as a team wasn't always effective, and that what was better is for people to be getting on with something, and then they would come to the meetings and tell us what they were doing, and then maybe we can provide them some support or something like that. So that, because it's always an individual who does things. So early on, we had to deal with some of the difficulties that many people experience in meetings, where you end up with not really enough getting done. So some of the problems which we faced are as follows. Firstly, having a discussion but not coming to a conclusion, or not recording what the conclusion was. That is, you think about the meeting a day or two later or the following week, and you can't remember what the conclusion was, or disagreements on what the conclusions were, or who was meant to take action. That is, sometimes we do come to a conclusion, but we can't remember who it is who was meant to take the action or what the action was. Now, what we remembered was that there was a tradition within the Quakers of trying to solve these problems. They have someone called the clerk at the meeting, whose job is to write down the minutes and then to read the minute out so the minutes are agreed during the meeting. That is, they're not written up later and everybody knows what the conclusion is and who's going to take action. Now, actually, it turns out that Google Docs and Zoom allows us to do this in a more modern way. So we've come up with this action table. So during the meeting, instead of just having our Zoom meeting looking at each other's faces, we also share a screen which has got a table on it like this. This is, we call it our action table. So each week, the date changes up here, and we store this table in a shared area on Google Drive. And so what we do is when we've got a new topic, we give it a topic title, then we explain what the item is about, and then we have a note here about what happens, what we decided at the beginning, and who is going to just the name of the person who's going to take the action. The following week, we come back to it and review what the decision was, and then any new information is put in a different color. And the week after, we do it in a yet different color. And then every now and again, we review the whole thing and simplify the diagram. This means that we've been able to benefit from the Quaker tradition of having everybody agree the minutes during the meeting, because that's what they're looking at on the screen. Another thing which we met early on, we call it problems in meetings number 2, is disruptive people. Now, this is not particular to our group, but is very common in many, many groups, particularly voluntary groups. So you can have people who dominate the meeting. They're stuck with their own ideas. They just keep going on and on and on, and not allowing, even though they allow other people to speak, they just keep on going about their opinion. Or alternatively, something which we have occasionally met is somebody being negative or dismissive about other people's actions. Now, we had a lot of discussion about this, and we have come to a way of working which seems to work well. What we do is this: we ask ourselves, does the other person come away from the meeting energized or demoralized? Because if they're coming away demoralized, then you've taken away the energy. Like, what is the point of a meeting? If some people come to a meeting with some energy for something, unless it is totally bonkers and everybody agrees they definitely shouldn't do it because it should be harmful, everybody should go away energized on how they're going to carry out the idea which they may have brought. Now, you've done all sorts of different things, but I know that one of the things you've done is take part in the consultation on the violence against women and girls strategy, which the government had recently. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done and whether you feel you've made any progress?
Yeah, a little introduction what that is. It was a consultation, a survey on what is called violence against women and girls, but this term is very misleading because it also covers male victims of intimate partner violence. But the consultation was so heavily gendered that it was almost impossible for male victims to fill it out. And many men's organizations such as Mankind have asked, and we did that as well, asked male victims to participate in this survey and to highlight their experiences. Recently, we read a comment from Domestic Abuse Commissioner Vera Baird that because of the answers that male organizations and men sent into this consultation, she started to become aware that a violence against women and girls strategy doesn't work well for male victims. I mean, it is surprising that it took this consultation for her to understand that. But on the other hand, we are more than happy that she actually acknowledged that, and in her comment, she really highlighted that violence against women and girls strategy and consultation is not well suited for male victims, and that it can actually be traumatizing for male victims to be covered under a Violence Against Women and Girls Act. Now, I tried to actually sue the government in regards to the consultation because it was so heavily gendered. But first of all, when you try to sue the government, you need a lot of money or you need the right lawyers. And at that time, we didn't have the right lawyers yet, and we didn't have the money, and we ran out of time. But I still do think that our attempt and our contact to the Home Office threatening them, I would think that it made a difference, because they start to feel watched, and they know that that they can't do anything they want to, that they can't just blatantly discriminate against men without people noticing.
Okay, I think that fits with my own experience, is that all we need to do is just keep plugging away. And the main reason that we've been doing so badly is that people haven't done enough. And that even if you do something which appears to have no effect, you don't know that it's had no effect.
Yeah, I think it is good for us as a group that each one of us sometimes has positive experiences, because we can share the positive experiences with the other members of the group, which makes it much easier to keep the ball rolling. I think if you work for yourself, you might be less aware of the positive impact that you have as an individual, but as a group, you see the positive impact that the others have as well. And obviously you can congratulate each other, which sometimes goes a long way.
David Eggins, you've been coming along to Gender Parity UK very regularly, missed very few, usually because you've been on a ferry. For well over a year. What is it that you get out of our weekly gatherings?
Well, I think particularly over the last year, when conferences and debating society type establishments have been well closed, then Gender Parity has given an opportunity to continue to network and also to advance the notion that domestic abuse, which is the particular aspect which I'm very interested in, that domestic abuse is very much more an equal phenomenon than it is a male-only phenomenon. And so in many respects, then equilaw represents really a mindset, or not a mindset, that's the wrong word, represents a very strong feeling which I have about the way in which the kind of work which we deliver needs to be properly produced, rather than the way in which it's being currently produced by CAFCAS and by other organizations. So,
okay, so I know you work with perpetrators of domestic abuse. So can you tell us something about the work that you do?
Well, I prefer to use the word domestic abusers, because perpetrators really implies that they're guilty of criminal offences, and obviously some of the people will be guilty of criminal offences, but many others are really just being accused of the behaviours, some of which will be quite destructive in relationships, and therefore the individual needs help to change their behaviours. So that's the guts of it. What else can I say about that? So we've been doing the work for the best part of 26 years, and we've always worked with men and women in mixed gender groups. Historically, there have been very, very many more men attending than women, but the information now, or the research now, is beginning to point to a much greater gender equity. So a bi-directional violence in couple relationships are amounting to more or less 60% of the cases which we would see, And then very, very astonishingly recently, the research statistics stating that unidirectional violence is more prominent from women to men than it is from men to women. And of course, underneath all of this are the children that experience the abusive behaviors of their parents. So I guess that's my biggest motivation as a former teacher. Then I would be looking for children to have the best possible background and best possible upbringing.
Okay, so what you're saying is the research is showing that that domestic violence and domestic abuse is much more equally spread across the genders, but that what you see in terms of these programs that you run is that very many more men are referred to them than women. Is that right?
That's not only right. I mean, that's an understatement. There are no women referred to the programs. CAFCAS, for example, the Children and Family Court Advisory and Support Service, the kind of official government agency, forwarded 909 men in the last accounting period, and not one single woman. Okay, and according to the statistics, then approximately 300 women, rather more than 300 women, should have also been being forwarded, but there are no programs for them.
Okay, do you know why they're not referring them?
Because there is no so-called accredited program. All of the programs which run are, in a sense, required to deal with the men as power and controllers in the relationship. And of course, you can't have male power and controllers as the underlying cause of female violence.
Okay, so you're saying it's because the sort of ideological narrative doesn't fit it that that they just haven't done anything at all. But
right.
you say that you do work with some women. So what's the difference
Right.
between your program and other?
Well, we don't have a primary focus on power and control for a start. Okay, we recognise that what goes on in couple relationships has got very little to do with power and control in the vast majority of cases. And so we've started to function or to focus initially on what was so-called anger management, but within a very short period of time, we recognized that anger was just one of the 8 primary declarative emotions which individuals needed help to regulate. And so we then set about and produced a neat little diagram, which is not the power and control wheel, but which focuses on 8 declarative emotions, which we help the individuals to find their way around and to understand the impact of those emotions on them and to recognize them when they actually cut in.
Is that because you think that a lot of violence and abuse comes about because people are experiencing emotions and not knowing what they are, or?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of ignorance about, well, there's a great deal of ignorance about emotions, to be perfectly honest. And it's also a very wide area which needs narrowing down so that people can actually begin to unravel just what's going on inside them. And from our perspective, then the individual needs, first of all, to be able to recognize themselves in an emotional state and to know what the cascade of behaviors is which follows that emotional state.
So it's rather than, it's like recognizing anger rather than being angry.
Well, that would be the first step of it. That's right. So first I've got to recognize myself in the state, which might be anger, might be fear, might be sadness and grief, might be ecstasy, might be disgust or a lack of attachment, and what then goes along with that emotional cascade.
So have you seen any progress in the last few years in recognizing official recognition of the balanced nature of domestic abuse?
I think wherever we read now, there's growing recognition of male victims. And so when you've got male victims, then obviously somewhere underneath all of that, you've got female abusers. And the female abusers tend to be excused their abuse for all kinds of ideological reasons. Those same reasons don't apply to the men. So, a woman that attacks a man that would be referred to as a preemptive strike, whereas a man that attacks the woman is just purely bullying her.
Yeah, I did
No
hear
difference to
a wonderful phrase, which is that women have problems, men are problems.
I think that would be a feminist view of the situation, almost certainly.
Yes. So has your participation in the gender parity meetings helped you advance your work?
Yes, it has. And it's also provided a wider forum and a wider understanding of the issues going on, because other people are busy reading and transferring their knowledge into our knowledge base as well, if you put it like that. So Terry White, for example, has enlightened us enormously from within the meetings about suicidality and all kinds of other issues which go on. So
thank you very much indeed, David. One of the things that we've done is created a website, which I'm going to share with you now. And on it, you'll find some resources, some of which you may find helpful. So looking at the screen now, you'll see that there are various tabs. And under the myths tab, what we've done is created a whole lot of pages which will give you a brief counter to some of the myths which are perpetrated, which disadvantage men. What we realized is that the narrative which says that men are oppressive, etc., and women are disadvantaged and oppressed is supported by about a dozen myths. And these myths are simply repeated as though they were true all the time. Some of them are more obvious, like gender pay gap, for instance, or that women are oppressed by patriarchy. And some of them are less obvious. Let's just take a look at suffragettes won the vote for women. Well, this turns out to be a myth. On this page, you'll find the general argument and also a link to a graph showing how men and women got the vote on different dates in the UK, and also a video about it. But the general line is that the myth is that votes for women were gained for the first time in the UK in 1918 following a campaign by the suffragettes. That turns out to be false. There was a group called the suffragists who have been working on it since 1897. And there was already, by 1910, a majority in the House of Commons in favour of votes for women. And it was only because of the worries of the Liberal Prime Minister that he might lose the general election if he gave women the vote, because he thought that they might all vote Conservative, because only land-owning women, property-owning women were going to be given the vote. So it's actually nothing to do with the suffragettes at all. Another thing which you may find helpful is some of our projects. Now, among the many things that we've been trying to do, which you'll hear about in this film, is some work which we've done on the Istanbul Convention. Now, this is quite a worrying development because it's quite typical of some of the things which we have found when we've started looking at things which appear innocuous. So the Istanbul Convention appears to be about combating violence against women and domestic violence. Now, who could possibly be against that? It's a really good idea. Unfortunately, what you find is when you start to look very closely, is that it's a very ideological document. For instance, it says that gender is not something which is based on your sex, but it's socially constructed in all cases, not just occasionally by people who think they're in the wrong body. Secondly, it says that violence against women by men is motivated by misogyny or hatred of women, despite the fact that there is no evidence that this is the case at all, and that most violence against women occurs because an argument gets out of control. It also encourages us to eradicate, this is the actual word they use, traditional roles such as father and mother. On top of that, it commits the country to teaching these values to children at all levels, including primary school, and that all UK laws need to be developed based on these values. Now, it seems to me that the majority of MPs and other people voting in favour of this document never read it. So we have done some work in trying to make this better understood. For instance, in creating this short video and linking to another video conference by some Polish campaigners, etc., etc. So you can find some more information there. And we have used this information in our communications with, for instance, with MPs. So instead of writing to them and giving them all the information, we just send a short letter and link to the information. Now, whether or not they read it, whether it makes a difference, we don't know. We don't have any proof yet. But what we're working on is on the basis that things change gradually. They change in the background, and that by plodding away at a few things, gradual change takes place. And you'll hear elsewhere in this video an example of that, where, for instance, the Victims Commissioner has come out in favour of a separate violence against men and boys strategy. Now, that's not something which would have happened unless a few people had sent in some responses to the Violence Against Women and Girls consultation. This is Terry White. He's been coming along to Gender Parity quite regularly for getting on for a year, I think. And you work on all sorts of different bits of government publications and things like that, Terry. Can you tell us a bit about what you've been doing?
Well, I came to Gender Parity basically because I was working around the family courts and looking into a few documents that have been produced by the government. And I was deeply shocked by the poor quality of assessment and data analysis that seems to be coming through. It seems to be highly focused on producing a particular result, rather than actually doing a decent and honest assessment of real data. And so shortly after I lodged my, or around the time that I lodged my submission for a judicial review of the Ministry of Justice Risk of Harms report, I came to Gender Parity because I was seeking to bounce some of this off other people, because, you know, looking at it, you think, you know, am I mad? Because it seems so improbable that such a revered, internationally revered institution as the UK Civil Service just seems to be producing, I don't want to swear, but producing very substandard output that seems to be devoid of any decent control, and it seems to be geared at producing a political result, which I know is not what the civil service used to be.
Yes, I remember we were looking at the hate crime consultation from the Law Commission. Initially, we looked at it and we thought, you know, they just haven't used the references right.
Yeah.
You know, it's just not a piece of scholarship. And then realized that it was far more than that, that actually it was a deliberate, you know, it's part of this sort of postmodern approach, where you start off with your conclusion. So they started off with the conclusion that violence against women was motivated by hate, and then used lots of statistics which didn't prove it at all to prove it.
Yeah, we found that in that there was a letter issued by the Victims Commissioner and the Acting Domestic Abuse Commissioner in March of this year, which said that misogyny was endemic throughout the criminal justice system. Yeah. And I wrote to them and said, well, you know, what's your evidence of this? And they just produced evidence that women's issues were not being prosecuted, but there was no evidence to say that this was a result of misogyny.
Yes.
And of course, you know, the majority of these issues are one person's word against another, so there's a massive problem with the evidence base. And But the assumption that is very much a critical theory basis, is to have this assumption that it ought to be this conviction rate for allegations,
Yes.
and say that it's not, and then and find that it's not the desired rate, and then say, well, that must be because of an oppressor or oppressed dichotomy.
It must
And
be
you see,
institutionally sexist.
yeah, and we see
Yeah.
it also in racism as well, and it's interesting to watch that working in parallel to our issues. When that race report came out, that was quite a good piece of work that actually looked at why are these things happening instead of assuming racism, and
Yeah.
found no evidence of institutional racism. We've got a very similar problem here, in that there's this assumption of institutional sexism, and they're fighting against this phantom ghost, whereas in actual fact it looks like, if you objectively examine the data, that the reason that we're getting some of the results that we're seeing is created by the different often biological reasons.
Okay. Yes. Because the fundamental basis of critical theory is that the society is sexist and is racist.
Yes,
So
that's
as I
right.
understand it, whereas you and I and the empirical tradition of the last 300 years would say, is racism present or is sexism present? Let's look at the data. Postmodernism says, how is racism or sexism manifesting in this situation?
Yes.
And what's extraordinary is that they are completely upfront about it. I know that earlier on you made a video about the risk of harms report, and it's been viewed over 1,000 times. Can you, in 2 sentences, say what you found in that report?
Well, no, not in 2 sentences.
Okay. So
but I'll try my best. The main thing that I found about that report is, again, it was not a report. It was not an activity that was designed to find information. In my view, it was designed to find a particular result. There were no. It was supposed to be done by a panel of experts, but there were no experts on that panel. They were all lawyers. There was perhaps one. There was one social worker, but no one with any technical credibility. They undertook this means of collecting their own data rather than looking at the real data. This was a product supposedly of the Ministry of Justice, and instead of looking at the wealth of data that the Ministry of Justice is sitting on, they went out and did something like a Twitter-esque poll of people to gather data. They got 80% female returns and 20% male returns in a private law arena where every case has a male and a female, or almost every case has a male and a female. So you should be expecting 50%. None of the respondents were verified. Mostly they were people who had actually lost their case in court. So therefore, the court had already looked at their stories and said, well, that's not quite adding up, so we don't believe you. And then they get to put it into the risk of harms report to criticise the court.
Can we just clarify for those who are not familiar with it? I think the risk of harms report is a report which suggests that men are a danger to their children in general, and therefore after separation there should not be a presumption of contact with the father.
We're learning more about how to do this. I mean, none of us are trained or educated or experienced in activism. So we're learning as we go. How can you actually get things done?
And can you just summarize why you found it helpful to join us on a Wednesday evening and chat about these things? Because most of the work you work on your own.
Yes, yeah, that's true. It's to get a sense check. When I came into this, I was concerned. I just hate getting things wrong, Mike. So
you might be deluded, you mean?
Yeah, and so just putting something in front of someone else who can look at it and say, well, maybe you've gone off your rocker here a little bit, or you've not considered this or whatever, and help you to sort of like put something together that's a little bit more structured and a little bit more correct, because putting incorrect things in front of people, destroys or makes it more difficult to get your point across in the future.
Okay. Well, that's great, Terry. Thank you very much. Hi, this is Sally Ann Burris. She runs a thing called Split the Difference. And we first met up with Sally, it must be 18 months ago, perhaps not as long as that, but you were organizing a march in London and looking for some publicity. And we discovered that you didn't know about a lot of the men's movement.
So I previously, it was actually 2019. So it was July, sorry, it was September 2019 when I actually met you all. And prior to that, I'd literally never seen a men's group, which was very bizarre because I'd been already working on this for about 4 years, 3.5, 4 years. And I had actively looked for men's groups as well. I obviously wasn't typing in the right thing in Google. And then when I organised this march, because we'd launched July the 1st, and I'm a bit of a doer, you know, so I'm a bit like, pack up your bags, right? What are you going to do about this? You can't sit down talking about it all day. And I'm a doer, so we'd organise this march. And then I'd then from a few different places, different men had contacted me, men's groups, and I was pleasantly surprised that I met you and Philip and a couple of other people as well. And it allowed me to see that actually at that time that people didn't seem to be very connected. But with gender parity, one of the things that gave me was it gave me this sense of, well, there are lots of people working on things and there's a way of being together, you know, and doing that together, which has proven to be absolutely priceless.
So that's great. And so you've joined us on and off because you do all sorts of different things. But a couple of months ago, you were telling us that you'd become a member of a committee. You can't give us the details about it, but that it had some input into government and that you were going to compile some information to pass on from the men's movement. Can you tell us a little bit about that without revealing your secrets?
Yeah, it's a bizarre situation for me because I've never been in. I've done lots of things with consultation group stuff in you know, government and stuff like that. Never actually been tasked with one that says, Sally, you need to keep this on the low profile. But yes, so I was approached about approximately, I would say 7-8 months ago now, with a request to join a consultation group, and that it was within the government. Like I said, I've done this many times before, and my first thing from that was, well, I'm doing my work, yes, you know, I work with Split the Difference, and I also work with Gender Parity UK, and I also work with the Minister for Men. But my first reaction was, this is an opportunity for people who work together and are really productive together to actually also include in that voice. So for me, it was just an instant reaction because I'm like, okay, there's the invite, but there's all these amazing people across the UK doing this amazing work. I need to involve them in that, you know, and that's why I brought it to Gender Parity. And you being you and all you guys in there, you've made it really easy and cool for me and gave me a ton of different types of information and stats and evidence and figures, and it's all contributed then to the input that I've given. And that work has been very inspiring for me, because if you're parts of groups, whether it's, you know, groups that, you know, that are just tentatively starting to look at these things in the places where they can make a difference, a big difference, I think it's really, really important that everybody gets to contribute to that. And I feel a bit blessed. I'm blessed to have been asked and blessed to be working with the people that I'm working with who are there and can contribute under their own name, you know, because there is a lot of us working out there in the world, and that's not always very visible. So I think it's really important that when if any of us are invited, that we also throw that net out and say, okay, you know, yeah, on this occasion I had to be quiet, which is hard for me. But, you know, it did mean that all of these amazing people that are doing all this amazing work were part of that. They contributed, you know.
So you asked a number of different people to contribute to different aspects of information, and you compiled a portfolio and took it along to the committee. And yes, although you can't tell us exactly where, you think that it's not an insignificant place. And you think that by keeping links with us on gender parity, this has given you more connections, so you are able to get more information together.
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I was very attracted to Gender Parity UK about was the fact that the whole setup is about being a think tank. It's about looking at what's coming out from government, looking at what's happening in the community, having a process where that can be evaluated, looking at truth and fact, and then putting out an output that says this is happening, that's happening, and trying to influence positive change, you know, and governance. I mean, that to me is it is one of the best things any group of people can do by working together. And it was profound for me. It still is profound for me.
Well, thank you very much. It's extremely interesting. I know you're doing lots of other things.
Now, Mike, you are the longest lasting member of Gender Parity UK. After I started the group, you created, outside of Gender Parity UK, something quite extraordinary, which a lot of people in the men's rights sphere have noticed, a so-called APPG. Would you like to tell us what that is and how you created it, or how you helped form it?
Okay, so APPG stands for All Party Parliamentary Group. And these are semi-official organizations in the parliamentary process. That is, they're not part of the government. They're really voluntary organizations made up of peers and MPs. But they have sort of a semi-official status. That is, there are some rules that you have to follow. So that, for instance, you have to have a minimum number of people. It's only about 6. But you do have to have a chairperson who is a MP, a member of the governing party, and you have to have at least one other officer from the main opposition party. So I got an email from Chris Badley in early December 2020 suggesting the idea. And to tell you the truth, I hadn't thought of it before. But, you know, sort of 20, 30 years ago, I was involved in politics with the Lib Dems. And so I have a sort of slight experience of Parliament and find them a bit less scary than some people do, perhaps. Anyway, so we looked up the rules of what we needed to do. We also contacted a number of people. For instance, I emailed Philip Davis, the MP who is, you know, being quite supportive of men's issues, and he thought it was a good idea. And I contacted William Collins, see what he thinks. And lots of people said, "Oh, what a good idea! Why has nobody done that before?" And I'm going, "Well, I don't know." And how do you do it? So first of all, we identified MPs and peers who had said helpful things in speeches or votes or something like that, and we wrote nice individual letters to them. And this had absolutely no effect at all. We didn't gain a single member by being nice to them. So we simply generated lists of MPs and peers. You can find all the information on the government website. Took a long time to put it together, but Chris was very quick, and we just sent hundreds of emails. Some personalized, some just chuck it all in the BCC column, and gradually got some interest. Interestingly, the most interest was from male Conservative MPs. We haven't managed to land any Labour MPs. Several have shown an interest, but it's almost as if, I don't know, something frightens them off. We do have 3 Labour peers, few crossbenchers. What's been interesting is that we thought that there might be a backlash, but we haven't kind of seen one. The first thing we did, which is what the first meeting decided, is we would try to describe what it's like for a boy today growing up in the UK, rather than going straight into one of the issues. So we've been working on that over the summer, and that will be published soon. But the The surprising thing, which I hadn't expected, was the suggestion of proposing parliamentary questions. These are questions asked by an MP of a minister, and they are required to answer within a certain time frame, and generally do. There is staff in every ministry who do it for the minister, and you can then use follow-up questions. There are also those are written questions.
Can I ask if some of these questions have been asked and what the responses were like, just as were you satisfied with the responses, and how do you plan to continue?
Well, the responses are almost universally unsatisfactory. So that, for instance, several people have asked about the educational achievement of boys. And the Minister, Nick Gibb, has said several times, we don't have a plan for dealing with individual groups of people. We only try to improve the learning of all students. So in the autumn, we're going to start attacking that, because clearly it's a policy that they've had for, I don't know, at least 10 years and clearly isn't working. I mean, if you've still got the disadvantages of boys and actually it's getting worse, then clearly your policy is not working.
And I think we also identified that there were clearly focuses on to help women, especially in the area of STEM fields. So the claim that there was no focus on specific groups doesn't hold.
That's right. I mean, I think that has become less. I think the funding for Athena Swan, for instance, has ended. Mm-hmm. So there are hopeful signs. I think the other hopeful signs is that the MPs and peers seem to be more on side than I thought they were going to be, and quite willing to ask difficult questions. I think that we're going to start working on men's health strategy next. I think that I'm not going to say easy win, but I think it's the sort of thing which probably could be achieved. And then, as you mentioned earlier on about the violence against men and boys strategy, that also may be something which is likely to make progress. Yeah. I hope you'll agree that in this short film, we've been able to show that a bunch of amateurs can actually have more effect than they thought they were going to have when they started. And if you feel that you would like to be involved in gender parity, then follow the link, which will come up soon, to our website, and just send us a message via the contact form, and we'll be in touch. On the other hand, if you happen to have quite a substantial amount of money and feel that we're doing such a good job that if we were to have an office and some part-time or full-time staff, we could be enormously effective, and this would be a good use of your funds, then we'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, we'll just plug on in our amateurish way and make a little progress. Thank you.